The following lesson is linked to Learning Outcome 2, Reading and Viewing. It addresses the assessment standard that requires learners to explore and explain key features of texts and how they contribute to meaning. Learners should be able to identify and explain the purpose, structure, and language use in texts. Learners should be able to distinguish between fact and opinion and give their own response. They should also be able to recognize some implied meanings.
Hi, I'm Megan. In this series of lessons, we've been looking at evaluating and comparing texts. We've learned a range of terms that you can use when comparing texts, and we've applied these to different texts taken out of newspapers. In today's lesson, we're going to look at a range of articles that appeared in the Sunday Times newspaper. All of them deal with the subject of childcare grants, but whereas some are factual, others are quite emotive. See if you can put what we've learned into practice. By the end of this lesson, you'll be able to differentiate between emotive and factual texts. By the end of this lesson, you will be able to compare texts on the same subject, differentiate between factual and emotional texts, and analyze texts using the appropriate terminology. Before we examine the articles, it's important that you understand what a child care grant is. A child care grant is money that the government makes available to people who care for children under the age of 7, whose parents or caregivers cannot afford to feed or clothe them. Think about what sort of articles might appear in the newspaper on this subject. Here are a few examples. Educational articles in which people are told how to apply for a grant, news articles in which the need for childcare grants are discussed, editorials where people express their opinions about the grants. Now, of these types of texts, which do you think are more likely to contain facts and which do you think are more likely to contain emotions? Emotive language uses words to persuade the audience to adopt the opinion of the writer. In this lesson, we're going to be looking at an educational article and 2 news articles. I'm sure you can think of other texts that might have been produced to illustrate the concept of child support grants, such as a political cartoon or maybe a graph tabling statistics. As we examine the articles, we're going to be looking out for the following features: the intention, the target audience, the genre, and the format. You should remember what these terms mean from previous lessons, but let's just recap them. Intention refers to the aim of the text. Target audience is who the ideal reader of the text is. Genre refers to what type of text is this, and format describes how the text has been set out and how the layout helps the text to achieve its aims. The first text that we're going to look at comes from the educational section of the newspaper. It explains who qualifies for a child support grant and how to go about applying for one of these grants. Before we look at the text, here's something to think about. What is the purpose of this text? What kind of language is likely to be used? What format or layout is likely to be used? And who is the target audience of this text? Let's look at part of this text and see if your predictions were correct. What you need to apply: child support grant. Must be a South African citizen and resident in South Africa. Applicant must be the primary caregiver of the child or children concerned, and the child or children must be under the age of 7. Notice how the layout is affected by what type of article this is. To analyze it more closely, let's look at our first question again. What is the purpose of this text? The purpose of this article is to educate and inform people about getting a child support grant. It is also designed to be encouraging, so because of this, the process is made to sound easy. The authors of this article are hoping that even if readers don't need a child support grant themselves, they might pass this information on to somebody who does. Let's look at the next question. What kind of language is used? The style of this text is fairly straightforward. Point form has been used, and everyday words that most people would understand have also been included. The language is quite formal. For example, it says, must be a South African citizen and resident in South Africa, instead of just must be a South African. This is because these are formal criteria given by the government. Let's consider the format or layout that have been used. The heading and subheading help to organize the information in an easy to understand way. The bullet points would enable somebody to check that they have everything they need in order to apply for a child support grant. The next thing to consider is, who is the target audience of this text? As I mentioned earlier, a text like this would have two possible target audiences: people who are eligible for a child support grant, or perhaps people who know people who might be eligible, and they can then pass this information on to them. I hope that you are starting to see how the purpose and target audience of a text help to shape it and help to determine what language is used. We're now going to look at another article that is also on the topic of child support grants. Dumped with Daddy, the sad scourge of moms who abandon their children and run off to spend the child support grant. Just from this heading and subheading, do you think this text is just a news article, or does it have an emotive quality? This article is obviously about mothers who take the child support grant that is intended for their children and spend it on other things, whilst the father, who actually looks after the children, is left with nothing. Let's take a close look at some of the words that were used. Dumped, daddy, scourge, abandon, and run off. What comes to mind when you hear the word dumped? I think of trash or garbage, something unwanted, so this word definitely has negative connotations. What about the other word that's used in this title, daddy? When you think of a daddy, you think of somebody who is caring and involved in the rearing of children. It's not quite like father, which is a more neutral term. Do you know what the word scourge means? You can work out from the context that it means something bad, a plague or affliction. The journalist is implying that not only is this a widespread problem, but it's a terrible fact of life. Abandon and run off also have negative connotations. These words imply that these mothers have no compassion. They have abandoned their parental responsibilities and are interested only in themselves. Now that we've had a close look at the words that have been used, let's answer the next question. What is the purpose of the text? The aim of this text is to raise awareness of this problem. The writer is clearly angry and disgusted with these women, and he wants them to feel ashamed of misusing the child support grant. Here's another question to consider. What format or layout is used? This article was printed in columns, like a newspaper article normally is. The heading, Dumped with Daddy, is also quite catchy because it's an example of alliteration. Alliteration is when the same consonant sound is repeated, in this case, dumped and daddy sound similar. This article is accompanied by pictures of children. This always has emotive appeal and would gain the reader's attention. Here's something else to consider. In the first text that we looked at, the writer used neutral words because the intention was to inform or educate. In the second text, the writer has used emotive words because he's trying to convey his opinion on the matter. Using emotive words is one way in which texts can be strengthened. Another way is by using case studies. Here is an example. 19-year-old Katelwa Masebe had no idea why her 8-month-old daughter, Andisiwe, was suffering from broken skin and an enlarged abdomen when she took her to Mount Aleph Hospital in the Eastern Cape. Now she knows. Her daughter is one of more than 700 children in the area who have been submitted to the hospital with malnutrition. This article appeared in the Sunday Times. Its aim is to highlight the plight of many children in South Africa who would go hungry if it wasn't for the child support grant. Let's have another look at the article. Why do you think the journalist has focused on Andisiwe when in actual fact 700 or more children in the area are in the same position? This journalist has chosen to begin the article with a case study, the story of Andisiwe, rather than mentioning the statistics. A possible reason why he's done this is because South Africans have become desensitized. We are so used to seeing figures in the press, crime statistics, reports of poverty and AIDS victims, that we are now numb to these figures. They mean very little in our lives. By seeing a child's photograph and reading about a specific child, Andisiwe, we are more likely to feel sympathy. Now let's consider the writer's purpose. Like most newspaper articles, the aim of this article is to inform. Because it mentions the problem of malnutrition, readers' awareness of this would also be raised. Later on in the article, it mentions child support grants as a means of overcoming malnutrition, so people would also be informed about this. Now let's look at the language that has been used. The language that has been used in this article is not as emotive as the previous text. However, it's also not as neutral as the first text that we've looked at. In this article, the journalist has chosen to use a case study as his means of being emotive. He's also used some medical terminology though. Let's look at these words. He says that she was suffering from broken skin and an enlarged abdomen. These help to give readers a mental picture and a better idea of what malnutrition involves. In this lesson, we've looked at 3 texts and we've looked at these features: intention, target audience, genre, and format. It's now time for you to analyze some texts by yourself. In this lesson, we have looked at texts that use emotive language and a text that uses more neutral language. For today's task, I'm going to show 2 quotations and I want you to answer the following questions. Has neutral or emotive language been used? And what is the speaker's intention in making the statement? The first statement was made by David Chauke, a man whose 4 children are all living with him. This is what he said. Life is tough. I lost my job last year. The children are starving because their mother takes the grant money away from them. The second statement was made by the spokesperson from the Gauteng Department of Social Services and Population Development. This is what he said. It is a criminal offence for a person to claim the grant if they did not stay with the child for whom the funds were intended. Well, that's all we have time for in this, our final lesson on evaluating and comparing texts. I hope that you have learned to see how to apply these features. intention, target audience, genre, and format, to texts that you might have to analyze in English texts and exams. Being able to apply these features when you are reading the newspaper will help to make you a more informed and critical reader, so be sure to put these skills to practice. Goodbye.